In this lecture, I will provide you with a brief introduction to both artificial neural networks and basic deep neural networks. But first, I'm going to talk about the principles that underpin artificial neural networks, because the very same principles, they feed into deep neural networks. So, this is the biological basis of neural networks. The human brain is composed of billions of nerve cells called neurons, and they are connected to other thousands of cells by something known as axons. Stimuli from external environment or inputs from sensory organs, and that could mean something that we see or receiving an injury, is accepted by dendrites over here. These inputs, what the dendrite receives, creates electrical impulses, and these electrical or nerve impulses, they travel through the neural network. The neuron can then send a message to the other neurons to handle the issue or not send it forward. So the information transfer will happen if the nerve impulse is of a certain strength. So assume that you move your hand. Maybe the information transfer may not go forward because maybe the impulse is not sufficiently strong. But suppose you break your hand or you break your arm, then you're going to feel some pain and you may respond accordingly, because when you get hurt or you receive such a massive injury, the information transfer would go forward because that nerve impulse, it crosses a certain pain threshold. And this is the machine learning implementation, and as you can see, these are the inputs and we assign weights to it, and essentially this is what every neuron comprises of. Y is the value which is produced by a neuron, and it is produced by multiplying the weight with inputs, and we pass it to something known as an activation function, and it is an activation function which checks the Y value produced by the neuron and decide whether the outside connection should consider the neuron fired or not. So if we think about it in terms of pain threshold, say you might start shouting if you break your leg, because the act of breaking your leg and the electrical impulse transfer that will happen after that is certainly going to cross the pain threshold. So the activation function will fire the neuron, and essentially at that point we can say that you're in pain. And there are different kinds of activation function that we use, things like step functions or sigmoid functions, and there are also things like ReLU and tan hyperbolic functions, and different kinds of activation functions, they lend themselves to different kinds of problems. For instance, for classification purposes, we usually end up considering the sigmoid function, and it is this which will sort of check the Y value produced by the neuron and decide whether this requires the neuron to be fired or not. And this is the basic machine learning implementation of a neural network, of a biological neural network. Now, what we do in with neural networks is that neurons are connected in layers so that one layer can communicate with other layers. So we have an input layer, we have one hidden layer, and we have an output layer. Input layers other than the input layer are called the hidden layers, and in neural networks we just have one hidden layer. So we are going to have an input layer, and anything besides this, well, apart from the output, is considered to be a hidden layer. And this is the upshot about artificial neural networks, that they just have one hidden layer, and the outputs are, and basically these feed into each other. And the learning for an ANN is the task of adjusting weights to minimize the error. So by default, we have the input layers and we assign weights to them, and which is multiplied by the input values, and these weights are usually assigned randomly. They are passed to the hidden layers, and it is in the hidden layer that the activation functions are fired, and then we get an output, and error minimization has to be carried out till the output the system produces is very close to the expected output, and the bespoke error minimization is done by backpropagation of error. So let us see. Now this is the backpropagation algorithm, and this is a method for training the weights in a multi-layer feed-forward neural network. So what you saw previously was a multi-layer feed-forward neural network which comprised of one input layer, one hidden layer, and one output layer. And with multi-layer feed-forward neural networks, we can have more than one hidden layer as well, and at that point they become deep neural networks, but that'll come up later. What backpropagation algorithm does is it models a given function by modifying internal weightings of the input signals to produce an expected output signal, and then the system is trained using a supervised learning method where the errors between the system's output and the known expected output is presented to the system to modify its internal state. So we are going to go on changing the weights. So every time we get the output, we will compare it to the expected output, and accordingly we will go on changing the weights till we minimize the gap between the expected output and the actual output. And there are different ways of doing it, and I'm not going to go into that right now because that's not quite important at this stage. But now I will introduce you to the common artificial neural network algorithms that we are going to cover in this course, and these are really quite powerful algorithms for different applications. So the most common one is the perceptron algorithm, and this is the simplest feed-forward neural network, and it does not contain any hidden layers, and it just contains of one single layer of output nodes. And this is a linear classifier, but it is a very powerful linear classifier. It takes some inputs like so, sums them up, applies the activation function, and passes them to an output layer. Then we have something known as multi-layer perceptrons, and as you can see, this has one hidden layer, input layer, and output layers. This class of networks consists of multiple layers of computational units, and they're interconnected in a feed-forward way. Each neuron in one layer has directed connections to the neurons of the subsequent layer. So again, each of these input neurons is connected to the different neurons in the hidden layer. How many neurons you should have in your hidden layer is something that is, that varies across different problems, and it's something that one can always test and experiment with. MLPs are very useful for nonlinear data because except for the input nodes here, each node is a neuron that uses nonlinear activation functions. So they can be sigmoid functions, ReLU functions, tan hyperbolic functions, and so on. And then this also utilizes the backpropagation technique for error reduction. Now I will just briefly introduce you to deep neural networks. Now in the basic implementation, because in this course we are just going to touch upon the most basic implementation of deep neural networks. Now this is a simple feed-forward network with many, and by many I mean 2 or more hidden layers, and these extra layers allow for the modeling of complex data. And in this course we are actually going to start with basic deep neural networks using something known as H2O, which is a very powerful machine learning framework. But in the next couple of lectures we are actually going to learn to implement some of the most common artificial neural network algorithms on different data, and also work through a small case study where we apply MLP algorithm in conjunction with principal component analyses to work with a very large data set. So all of that is coming up in the next couple of lectures.